So we have another Final Fantasy VII Rebirth interview, this one focusing a lot on the role of Naoki Hamaguchi and what a lot of his day-to-day tasks are, but also what his general experience has been growing up as a fan of Final Fantasy VII and getting to work on a huge project like Rebirth. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button and subscribe if you'd like to stick around. It's always appreciated. So this article comes to us from Bloomberg, and in it they got to kind of pick the brain of Naoki Hamaguchi, who initially started off as someone who was a massive fan of Final Fantasy VII. He would grow up, become a developer, and find himself working at Square Enix, and eventually becoming the lead director on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which that's got to be an absolute amazing feeling. That's a literal dream come true, saying that you grew up playing a big game, and maybe one day you were going to work for that company, but now you're working on the remake of that game. That's just mind-boggling, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. He seems like genuinely a really cool dude who is very passionate about Final Fantasy, and he knows what it takes to make these games stand up side to side essentially with the originals. But this article really kind of goes into his experience as being kind of a fan turned developer. And there's one thing we're going to start off first here, and I do want to give a spoiler warning, because if you haven't played the original Final Fantasy VII and you're going in fresh with Remake, this part here that we're going to talk about is kind of spoilerish, and it involves two characters in particular. So if you don't want any spoilers, I'll make chapters on this video so you can skip ahead and avoid those spoilers, but we're going to talk about that starting now. Early in 7 Rebirth, Cloud tells of events that happened 5 years before the start of the game. During the flashback, Cloud's mannerisms are very similar to those of another character, Zack, in ways that seem uncanny and intentionally disconcerting to new players, hinting at a potential plot twist further down the road. That sort of subtle storytelling wasn't possible in the original Final Fantasy VII, with its rudimentary graphics and lack of voice acting, but the original developers intended to drop the Cloud-Zack hints all along. 2.5 decades later, Hamaguchi and his team can flesh out ideas that the PlayStation 1 couldn't handle. Hamaguchi says, "Now, users are able to have this new discovery." And that to me is really cool, because I'm starting to wonder how many of those original ideas that they had for the OG Final Fantasy VII that maybe didn't make it into the game, or were in the game but they couldn't really convey it because of the limitations of the hardware. And how much of that are we going to see in Rebirth and in Part 3? And this one exact example is pretty good, because I remember playing the original Final Fantasy VII, and when you see these flashbacks of Cloud, even with the dialogue, you can tell something's different. Cloud is not the same Cloud that we've come to know in the main present. He's acting a little happier, a little bit more jovial, out of character, I guess is the best way to put it. And there's really only so much that they could do back then with those graphics and the chibi characters, because you didn't really have facial animations. The best you could do is just have a character like Cloud just kind of shrug his shoulders and tilt his head. But now that they're able to work with hardware like the PlayStation 5 and PCs and take those original ideas and implement those little hints along the way in a way that actually you can see it and you can feel it, you can hear it with the dialogue. And seeing that footage in particular of the flashback with Cloud and Sephiroth and Tifa, Cody Christian is just killing it with his voice acting. He is nailing the Zack persona to an incredible degree, and it is a little uncomfortable to see, because you're like, I'm not used to seeing Cloud this way. But knowing that they can now pull from these old school ideas and actually flesh them out in a way that works is very exciting, and I really cannot wait to see what other older ideas they had that maybe didn't make it in that can now make it in because of the new hardware that they're working with. Now, this next section is very interesting, because Naoki Hamaguchi speaks on his role of kind of having to push back sometimes with people like Kitase and Nomura with some of their ideas. And with this interview in particular, they mentioned that Kitase at one point in time wanted to change the way the reactors looked in Remake. He wanted to do a complete redesign and overhaul, and Hamaguchi stepped in and he said basically, no, you cannot change that. These are too iconic. And thank God for that. The Mako reactors in particular, those are things where if you were to show someone who's a gamer and maybe hasn't played Final Fantasy but they know of it, if you showed them a picture of the Mako reactor, chances are they could tell you what it was and what game it came from. That imagery is just too iconic, and having somebody like Hamaguchi, who first and foremost grew up as a massive fan of Final Fantasy VII, working with Kitase, he can offer a perspective that Kitase just might not see. Kitase is someone who's been with the franchise since almost the beginning, I think. I don't even remember what his first Final Fantasy was, but when you're someone who's been working that close on a project in a game for over 20 years, sometimes you just have blind spots, or you just have ideas that you think might be a good thing to do, like, hey, we should redesign this specific thing or this character. Sometimes having somebody like a Naoki Hamaguchi step in and be like, look, I'm a fan, I know what the fans think of these games and this imagery, it's too iconic, you can't change these things, you gotta keep them the same. Having that type of perspective is just so valuable for a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and pretty much the entire remake trilogy. It's a really valuable asset to have on your development team because you can have someone with that outside perspective be like, look, you've been working pretty close on these projects. I can offer you a fan perspective as well as a developer perspective. So that's something that I think is absolutely amazing about this development team. And we're going to touch on another similar situation with this next section of the article, which deals with the fact that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out only 4 years after Final Fantasy VII Remake did. And how in the hell was that even possible? You know, to get something out the door that quickly, that high quality, in this day and age where games are literally taking 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to come out. I mean, like, how long has Rockstar been working on GTA 6, for example? The fact that they're getting Rebirth out 4 years is pretty astounding. So how are they able to do that? And Hamaguchi goes on to say that 80 to 90% of the Final Fantasy VII Remake development team stayed on board to help develop Rebirth. So they were able to basically go from Remake, transition into Rebirth, and everybody knew their roles. So if they had any specific issues with gameplay or graphics or sound, they knew who to go to. It wasn't a situation where you had almost completely new staff coming on board and everyone's trying to learn their roles and figure out what's the answer to this problem, who do we speak to about this. So because of that, they were able to really kind of work together and create a very efficient workflow to ensure that this game didn't have any delays like the original 7 Remake did. And you can maybe chalk up the OG 7 Remake's delay to COVID because it was coming out during the height of the pandemic when it was really getting started, so that may have slowed some things down, but people staying on board is really great. And this leads me to my last example, and I've talked about this in previous videos, but the development teams for Final Fantasy VII Remake's trilogy, as well as a game like Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake, are legitimate lightning in a bottle, and it's probably something that you won't be able to replicate in the future, because both of these development staffs consist of people who worked on the original games. So those people have the perspective of what it took to make those games back in the day, what they need to stick to, and maybe what they want to improve upon. But they also consist of people who grew up as fans, playing the games as kids, who would grow up, become developers, and somehow find themselves working at Square Enix and Capcom. And they can now offer a fresh perspective of, sure, you guys made the originals, but we know what modern gaming sensibilities are, what makes modern games fun, which allows them to create these games that not only are super polished and come out fast. You know, I played Resident Evil 4 earlier this year. I just finished the DLC with Ada, the Separate Ways DLC, and those are two incredibly awesome pieces of video game content. Very few bugs, great pacing, great graphics, they play well, they're super well made, and they come out fast. You know, I think it was RE2 Remake that came out in 2019, and a few short years later, they've already got Resident Evil 4 Remake coming out. And I don't have the exact numbers on the development staff, but a majority of the people that did RE2 Remake immediately shifted over to Resident Evil 4 Remake, just like the, you know, Remake to Rebirth team for the Final Fantasy side of things. So everyone knows their roles. They know what they're bringing to the table. And having that kind of development team leads to a game that is a really nice blend of being a remake, but also being a reimagining, because you have all of these old school and newer perspectives. And there was a really well done documentary series on the Resident Evil YouTube page, which I'll leave a link to in the description down below. But it's basically a developer roundtable, and you get to see all of the different developers from the OGs to the people who were fans that then became devs, and they just talk about the process it took to make these games, down to graphics and meeting the actors and gameplay and even toilets. There's a section specifically talking about toilets because infamously in the original Resident Evil 2, the RPD did not have a bathroom. That was something a lot of fans pointed out, so they made specifically sure to include an overflowing toilet in the remake. But just to see these teams consist of the OGs and fans who can offer different perspectives to one another just shows how beneficial it can be. You create this really incredible workflow that allows these games to come out fast, but also very polished. And that's not something you see a lot of in gaming these days. I know there's a lot of turnover for Western studios in particular, but this is something that is literally just lightning in a bottle, and it makes me very excited about Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, and hopefully that means that the Rebirth development staff will move over to that game as well. And it also makes me excited on the Resident Evil side of things to see if the Resident Evil 2 and 4 remake teams move on to maybe another remake or a brand new Resident Evil, because I freaking love Resident Evil 2. I know I primarily talk about Final Fantasy on this channel, but I would love to branch out and just kind of include more RE stuff because it's one of my favorite franchises, and getting to talk about it whenever I can is super exciting, and it's very refreshing. So with that being said, that's pretty much the video. I thought this was a pretty short article, but super insightful in regards to Naoki Hamaguchi's role as kind of being the in-between of I was a fan, but now I'm a developer who's working with the OGs. Leave any of your thoughts in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.